If I asked you what the most important amplifiers were in the heavy metal genre, what would you say? There are those among you that would probably wax philosophical about the 5150 and how the block letter is the best metal amplifier of all time. Some of you might point to more boutique amplifiers and builders like Fortin and Fryette. Certainly at least one of you would shout out Engel, the German metal tone masters. And if you're a fan of this channel, then you might even say something like how 𝐒𝐏𝐄𝐒𝐿𝐄 GX line was the peak of metal guitar tone. While all of those are certainly valid and worth mentioning in the context of heavy metal guitar tones, I want to dive into what I consider the originators of metal guitar tone. Marshall. Think of this as a Prometheus to Alien sort of story. It's actually kind of crazy how far-reaching Marshall's influence can be felt. Like if you ask random guitar players what they think of when they think of Marshall guitar tone, depending on what player you ask, you might get something like this. Or this. Or even this. Whereas I think of this. Now, there is a tremendous amount of history to cover here with Marshall amplifiers, and a lot of people have already gone over the early days, including Marshall themselves. If you want to deep dive into Marshall's origin story, I encourage you to watch their series Play It Loud, The History of Marshall, which has a staggeringly low amount of views for how high the production quality is. Instead, the approach that I'm going to take in this video is from a metalhead context, going through different amplifiers from different eras and seeing not only the tones they produce, but the vibe as well. I tried to collect a wide variety of amplifiers for this video. I even bought one of these things right here, but I can't show it to you because it doesn't work. Is this what you call excellent condition? Excellent condition, my ass. So unfortunately, we'll have to save this one for a future video. We're gonna explore some of the different amplifiers over the generations with the help of my buddy Bryce from the band Silver Talon. For those of you complaining that I play the same riffs in every video, there you go. Aren't you happy now? If you enjoy heavy metal, make sure to check out Bryce's band and his YouTube channel as well. I will link both in the description. We'll also be using a Tube Screamer style boost in this video from my company, Obsidian Audio. I could use a normal TS9 or something, but this has a built-in gate, and some of these amps are just loud, like really, really loud. So that gate is super helpful. And while I'm giving credits, I also want to thank Sweetwater and Marshall for making this video possible. Again, all of the links in the description, you know how this works by now. I also realized that the timing of this video would be a perfect segue into one of the new modified series amplifiers, and I did try to make that happen, but we're just gonna have to acknowledge it instead. Sorry about that. Back to what I was saying, I want to pay particular attention to one amplifier that Marshall manufactures currently toward the end of the video. The Dual Super Lead HR, or the DSL HR if you want to be abbreviated about it, which Sweetwater claims in their marketing, and I quote, Marshall's DSL HR is an all-tube twin-channel beast capable of conjuring any classic Marshall sound, past or present, end quote. We'll see about that. Such a stupid bit. Marshall Amplifiers was founded in 1962, and to reiterate here, if you want all the details, watch the Marshall documentary on their channel, as I'm going to paraphrase and skip over a lot of the history. At that time, importing the popular Fender amplifiers was incredibly expensive due to the post-war devaluation of the pound, as well as everyone's favorite current hot-button topic, tariff. This made importing the American amplifiers too expensive for most people living in the United Kingdom and broader parts of Europe. Marshall responded to this demand in the market by creating their first amplifier, the JTM45. At the time, most of the rock bands that were playing shows had a major issue, one that I'm sure you can relate to if you've ever played or attended a show at a VFW hall. It was very difficult to get enough volume to hear your guitar over not only the drummer, but the crowd as well, especially since PA systems at the time weren't nearly as sophisticated as they are today. As a result of trying to constantly push the sound louder, distortion was introduced by simply trying to be heard. At that time, distortion was considered undesirable in an amplifier because it was seen as a symptom of not being able to push the volume of an amp loud enough. But the musicians of the time started embracing the distortion and using it in their music, which started a revolution in guitar tones and even musical genres for that matter. And I think this is really interesting because it's a case of which came first, the chicken or the egg? Were bands starting to play more angry and aggressive music because these sorts of amplifiers were becoming available? Or were these amplifiers becoming available because the kids wanted to play loud and angry aggressive music? One thing that I want to point out here that I think is a key detail is while other manufacturers were trying to solve the problem of amplifiers distorting at louder volumes, Marshall leaned into it. This is at least partially due to the fact that the Marshall store in Hanwell, England had become a local hangout for young aspiring musicians of the time, an incredibly valuable happenstance that was embraced by Jim Marshall. He had a direct line to the up-and-coming artists and as a result was able to cater his new amplifier business to meet their needs, which meant, you guessed it, more distortion. Now, the amplifiers went through several revisions in those early days as the company grew and expanded its offerings. But the real breakthrough for our purposes here was the 1959 Super Lead, which might sound confusing since it was released in 1965, but don't get too hung up on that. 1959 was the catalog number for the amplifier, not the year of manufacturing. These amplifiers are often referred to as Plexis, along with other similar amplifiers due to the plexiglass front panel many of them were made with. However, the one that Bryce and I checked out had a brushed metal panel since it was made in 1972, so is it a Plexi still? I don't know. You decide. We chose to refer to it as a 4-holer since it has 4 inputs, both low and high gain, one being a brighter channel and one being darker. The unique characteristic of this amplifier is the inputs could be ran in parallel by using a small patch cable as a jumper between the channels. Now, the 4-holers had one big problem. In order to get them to have that sweet, sweet saturation, they had to be cranked up to deafening levels. The one that we're using in this video had been modified by the owner. Shout out to Trevor from Arcane Amplifiers here in Portland, Oregon. So it wasn't completely deafening to us when we recorded this bit, but it was still so loud. I mean, I had to plug my ears the whole time. I don't know how Bryce was sitting next to it for so long, but yeah, loud AF. Another key point that I want to make here, and I'm paraphrasing, but to make these amplifiers louder, not only did you need more raw power from the amplifier, but you needed more higher power speakers to send that power to. I just said power a lot. And in 1965, with the introduction of the Plexi, Marshall also started making speaker stacks that were 8x12, but later reduced these to 2 4x12s for logistical reasons. This is where the stack came from, something that's still used to this day, unless you're one of those guys that runs your quad cortex directly to front of house. And this started the battle of excessive guitar amplifier stacks on stage. Now, while Marshall had been doing modifications at their customers' requests, they hadn't officially released any amplifiers to combat this issue. Then in 1975, they released the Master Volume Series 2203 and 2204 models, which were 100 and 50 watts respectively. This allowed guitar players to crank up their preamp volumes to get that saturation that was becoming increasingly popular in rock music without completely blowing up their ear holes. And modifications like this had already been taking place from other builders as Marshall amplifiers increased in popularity. As a matter of fact, a large amount of amplifier manufacturers that you see today got their starts doing mods on Marshall amplifiers. People like Reinhold Wagner, Mike Soldano, Paul Rivera, and many others all started out modding amplifiers before creating their own unique circuits. And this is where, in my opinion, the birth of heavy metal guitar tone originated. And while there were many examples of modded Marshalls that we could talk about, I want to focus on the one specifically that I think is the most iconic, and that's the Jose mod. Jose Arredondo was a well-respected amplifier tech in the LA area that started modifying amplifiers in the late 60s. But what most people associate him with is specifically his Marshall modifications that would give players more of that glorious gain. And what arguably propelled him into the limelight as the high gain amp guru was his work with the then up-and-coming guitar virtuoso Eddie Van Halen. The Brown sound and Eddie Van Halen's guitar tone across the early Van Halen albums has been documented to death across the internet, but to paraphrase, Eddie had been messing with variable voltage transformers called variacs in conjunction with his Marshall Super Lead. Now, some people say that he was using it to tweak his tone, while others say he was simply using the variacs as a way to control the overall volume of his amplifier. All of these points could be a rabbit hole of a video in and of itself, so I'll just leave it at this. Eddie was constantly tweaking, searching for better and better high gain tones, and also notoriously kept a lot of what he was doing secret, and even gave false interviews to throw people off, so take from that what you will. Again, this is one of those topics I'd love to hear your thoughts on, and if you have anything to contribute, definitely leave it in the comments below for other people as well. Well, 𝐒𝐄𝐄 had solutions for the problems that these amplifiers faced for high gain enthusiasts, and among them was the master volume mod, something that became common due to the previously discussed volume issue. He also did other mods like adding a preamp stage as well as diode clipping. Diode clipping is interesting because something very similar can and has been done to achieve a comparable result, and that is simply running an overdrive pedal into the front of your amplifier to boost it. Which leads me into the next, and in my humble opinion, the most iconic of all of Marshall's amplifiers, specifically for metal, the JCM 800. The JCM 800 quickly became the go-to for metal bands in the 80s, everything from hair metal to thrash and so on. Many choosing to have them modded with the 𝐒𝐄𝐄 mod, but also many players choosing the less invasive option of throwing a tube screamer in front. And to me, there isn't a more iconic 80s metal tone than a tube screamer boosted JCM 800. The JCM line of amplifiers would be a mainstay for Marshall, later evolving into the JCM 900 in the 90s, and you guessed it, the JCM 2000 in the 2000s. Marshall decided to abandon the JCM naming convention, later naming this series of amplifiers the JVM, and eventually evolving them into their current model, the DSL series. But I want to take a detour here in the 90s because it's an interesting time in the world of metal and high gain amplifiers. There were plenty of new solid-state amplifiers popping up on the market that were not only incredibly versatile, but in most cases much more inexpensive and lighter than their tube counterparts.
In standard layman's terms is you can get anything from a Marshall sound to a thrashy transistor sound to a pretty warm boogie sound just by the shape, just by the turn of the shape matrix. Very, very powerful for its size and also very, very reasonable in terms of price.
So Marshall had to make the tough decision to either make a solid-state amp to compete or to stick with what had made them popular in the first place. The tubes, or valves as they're called in the UK. Well, in true Marshall fashion, they chose both, and this gave us the Valvestate. Not only did they still have the JCM line of amplifiers, but in 1991 they released the Valvestate, which was a mainly solid-state amplifier with a single 12AX7 tube, or valve, in the preamp section. This amp was used famously by the band Death, but later by bands like Static X and even Meshuggah in the early days. I've made videos on these amplifiers in the past, and it's definitely something I'd like to revisit at a later date, but my take on them has always been that these amps were made popular by the bands using them, and the bands that were using them were probably using them primarily because they were affordable alternatives to the tube options that were available at the time. Although I will admit that the percussive and distinct scooped and bitey gain that the Valvestate had was a staple of metal guitar tone in the 90s and early 2000s, so maybe I'm wrong, or maybe both things are true. Either way, one of the more interesting characteristics about this amp is the contour knob. It allowed you to scoop the mids or enhance them, an option that would be referred to as new guy or old guy mode by Marshall and Guitar Center employees alike. By 1992, the previously mentioned pioneer of saturated shred, Eddie Van Halen, had teamed up with Peavey to take all of his knowledge and taste and put it into the new 5150 all-tube amplifier. Also, other companies had been starting to gain, get it? Sorry, couldn't help myself, popularity in the high gain space with metalheads, including brands like Engel, Mesa Boogie with their dual rectifier, and later Bogner. Metalheads now had a plethora of options, but Marshall still held their grip in the genre, specifically with bands like Slayer, Judas Priest, and an unlikely source of Marshall popularity in metal, black metal. Yes, that's right, Marshall JCMs were the go-to amps for a lot of black metal bands, which I think is pretty cool actually. Look, there's an undeniable aura that Marshall amps bring with them, and even though that music culture might be one that Marshall doesn't want to associate itself with for obvious reasons, can't really imagine these bands using anything else. All right, so that brings us to the current day and the DSL lineup of amplifiers, the amps that Marshall claims can recreate any era of Marshall tone. And I feel like now we have a pretty good handle on what that means. So let's dive in real quick and see if it can do that. All right, as I alluded to earlier, we're gonna plug into this Marshall DS. I already plugged into it. I'm plugged into it, past tense. I'm plugged into this Marshall DSL. I'm using this Jackson Kelly. I wanted to use EMGs to sort of match what Bryce was doing earlier in this video. And you know, this one just like kind of matches aesthetically. I feel like I get an A for aesthetics. We're starting on the clean channel here. Seems like an appropriate place to start, right? You know, it's a little bit gritty. Of course, you can turn down the volume. It matches the vibe of those earlier one-channel Marshalls. Let's turn the gain up there, like maybe around 1 o'clock. We start to get a little bit more gritty, very much reminiscent of those early one-channel amplifiers, the four-holers, if you will. Let's turn this all the way up here. And we're getting even more in line with the crunchiness of those early amplifiers. Now, one thing that I want to point out here that I feel like is kind of important is I have the preamp volumes cranked all the way up on here. And then I have the master volume pretty loud too. I found that I got the best results and response from the amplifier dialed in this way. The only way that I'm able to do this sitting next to a cabinet right now is I actually have a load box and I'm running into an IR. You know, unfortunately, sorry. This would be way too loud for me to sit next to right now. Again, just like the old school, you know, non-master volume control style Marshall amplifier. The other thing here is I pretty much have the resonance off. I mean, it's just like a little bit like a scotch, but the resonance control is a newer, more modern feature. We'll go into that here in a minute, but let's just keep going. We're just like progressing through the eras chronologically, kind of, right? So let's go over to the red channel here and we'll do the gain at noon. And this is pretty much right where the green channel left off. It is very reminiscent to me tonally of that cranked super lead that we have, except, you know, I'm not listening to it through the actual cab, so I'm not having to plug my ears. And it's kind of getting into that JCM 800 territory, which surprisingly, from comparing that earlier super lead to the JCM 800, there wasn't really as much of a difference as I thought there would be. So let's boost that. The way that I have this pedal set up right now is the EQ is flat, so we're not really adjusting the EQ, we're just driving more volume into the front of the amplifier. And it's also quiet now too, which is a nice feature. So you can definitely tell boosting the signal gave us like more punch, a little bit more saturation, but we're still very, very dry. Let's go ahead and just turn the gain all the way up here. Now we're getting more sustain. It actually added low end too. It gave us a little bit more girth in the tone by doing that. And again, that's sort of my experience with like the JCM 800 style amplifiers. But let's go over here to the ultra gain setting on the green channel at noon. We'll turn the boost off and we'll see if we're more in line with the JCM era amps. We're definitely getting more into metal territory here. This reminds me a lot of a JCM 800. My experience, at least, with the JCM 800. You know, it's fatter sounding, it's more compressed sounding. And the only thing that we've changed here is the different channels and the different gain modes on each channel. We haven't touched the EQ or anything like that. So, you know, I just wanted to do that intentionally so that you could hear the differences in between all these amplifiers. And again, to test, you know, can you get any era of Marshall tone out of this amplifier? This is the red channel. The gain's at about 1 o'clock, no boost. In my experience with Marshall amplifiers, this is so much more gain than I am used to. And we're gonna turn the bass down here a little bit too. of the interesting things, once we get here, we could detour a little bit. There's actually this tone shift knob right here. And to me, this kind of reminds me of the Valvestate, you know, with the contour knob. You know, to me, it's not exactly the sound that I would associate with Marshall, but I think it's just, you know, it's just like a little extra thing if you wanted to dial some Valvestate era tones, you know, the new guy tones. Let's do the resonance knob here. I just want to turn this thing up and show you. I think it's very interesting. But I think they just wanted to give you like a lot of versatility with this thing, you know what I mean? For I think it's $830 for the price point on this being a sub $1,000 amplifier. I think it's kind of crazy. I think it's kind of crazy what you get with it. All right, some things that I want to talk about as I've had time to reflect. There is something undeniable about all of the older amplifiers that we tried out in this video, and I didn't get to cut in every single one. Like we had a vintage modern in here, and then we had another 100-watt JCM 800. So this was a pretty fun exercise in exploring Marshall amplifiers as someone who doesn't use them a lot. And what I found really interesting about it was the older amplifiers, when you push them, they do have quite a bit of gain, like quite a bit more than I remembered or than I thought they would. And to reiterate what I was talking about at the beginning of the video, with Marshall being sort of the godfathers of heavy metal guitar tone, I think that has a lot to do with them leaning into it. You know what I mean? And it makes you wonder, were they just supplying what people wanted? Or is it because as these amplifiers were becoming available, more artists were able to express their creativity that they were limited with before with the previous amplifiers from other companies that, you know, they just wanted to go clean while Marshall was like leaning into the distortion and the gain. I'm really curious to hear your guys' thoughts on that down in the comments. I ran a poll before I released this video. Thank you so much to all of you that participate in those. And it was really interesting to hear everyone's feedback on it and what they think of when they think of high gain tones and, you know, which amplifiers come to mind. It's really interesting. Those older Marshalls just really have something special about them. And while they're, you know, very expensive on the used market, you know, you're spending thousands and thousands of dollars, I think they capture some of that in their more budget options like the Origin and then even the DSL. Like I said, for under $1,000, I think you get a pretty dramatically wide range of Marshall tones in that amplifier. But out of all of those amplifiers we tried, I'm really vibing with this one the most. This is a 1987 JCM 800. This is the 50-watt version. And one of the things that was really difficult to capture and translate over YouTube that I just kind of wanted to try and explain to you verbally is, while these amplifiers all, you know, sound like in the same ballpark, there's something about these older vintage iconic amplifiers like this JCM 800. There's something about the way that they respond under the fingertips and the way that they sound in the room that was quite a bit different from everything else. You know, they just sound bigger and fuller, like they would fill an arena. I don't know, I'm probably doing a terrible job of explaining this, but there's definitely like a difference in term, but when it's translated over YouTube and recorded and stuff, it's not as noticeable of a difference. So, you know, I just wanted to be transparent with you about that and explain it. Okay. All right, I hope you enjoyed this video. It was a really fun one to make. If you really like what I do here, consider subscribing or being massively OP and joining the homies over here on Patreon, where you get behind the scenes access, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye, guys.